Trigger warning for this episode. I am starting us off strong because you guys need to hear it. Violence against children, violence against women, race, gender, sexism, lynching. Please take care of yourself. Know that this is your warning now, because if I didn't have it now, I'd be saying it throughout the whole episode. Batten down the hatches, buckle your seatbelts. We are getting into stand your ground laws, the Castle Doctrine, and self-defense. Let's fucking ride. Please note as well for this episode, all of the sources that I will be citing from and pulling from will be in the show notes, okay? Every statistic that I name, every figure and number that I provide to you is not pulled from www.rebsresearch.com. It is pulled from empirical studies taken and done by many different groups, okay? Whether it be sociological groups, whether it be legal groups, whether it be medical and health groups, okay? When dealing with the rise of certain violent crimes, violent acts, et cetera, everything that comes out of my mouth on this podcast, other than my opinions, which are always correct and perfect and gorgeous, has a receipt attached to it. Whether it be from a case, whether it be from a judge, whether it be from a study, whether it be from a graph, whether it be from an interview, whether it be from a book, whether it be from something, okay? I trust that y'all are smart enough to be able to discern what I say is an opinion and what I say is me pulling from something, okay? If you have a question or a problem, raise your hand, put it on your keyboard, type in google.com, and Google whatever I just fucking said, okay? Perfect. I definitely am not holding myself to perfection on this podcast, in this podcast, but I am doing everything I possibly can to make sure that what I say goes. That doesn't mean there isn't a corrections corner. There needs to be one, let me know. But yeah. Read the sources, go to the sources, the sources, and then decide for yourself. Love ya. I'm reading from the book written by Caroline E. Light, titled Stand Your Ground, A History of America's Love Affair with Lethal Self-Defense. Americans account for less than 5% of the world's population, but possess 40 to 50% of its guns. Recent studies have estimated that there are now more guns than people in the United States, far more weaponry than in any other comparably developed nation. Our nation also boasts the highest per capita rate of gun deaths and deaths by mass shooting, defined as an episode in which 4 or more people are killed or wounded. In 2015 alone, there were 372 mass shootings, resulting in 475 deaths. White men are disproportionately the shooters in these and other episodes of mass gun violence. Guns and their proliferation in the United States are only the tip of the iceberg of a much larger and more widespread belief system that frames lethal self-defense as a core ideal of good citizenship. This principle places idealized, law-abiding citizens, quote unquote, not all citizens, in the service of lethal self-defense and equates good citizenship with the capacity to stand one's ground against criminal strangers. According to the National Rifle Association, the NRA, a good citizen is an armed citizen. This ideal suggests that we must all be prepared to defend ourselves. However, our contemporary call to arms is based on unspoken but powerful assumptions that exclude many from the protective and exonerating rhetoric of, quote, law-abiding citizenship. Appeals to individual DIY security as the solution to our nation's most urgent anxieties criminalizes many who do not fit the terms of idealized citizenship, particularly people of color, gender nonconforming people, and the poor. Moreover, women of all races, classes, and ethnicities often find themselves criminalized if they try to stand their ground against violent male partners. When contemporary advocates of lethal self-defense rally law-abiding citizens, quote unquote, to take up arms against criminal strangers, they participate in a prolonged tradition of excluding and criminalizing the real victims of violence, the groups historically most in need of protection. Standing one's ground against a perceived threat has long been a white, masculine prerogative in the United States. When European settlers arrived on American soil, they justified violence as necessary to their basic survival, seizing land that was already inhabited while imprisoning or exterminating its occupants. Settler colonialism and later the idea of manifest destiny, spreading civilized Christianity across the continent, together demanded the subjugation of non-whites, and the rights, privileges, and protections of citizenship were inaccessible to all but white, property-owning men. As Americans, our textbooks and memorials celebrate armed defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, of resisting the urge to flee in the face of fear. From the American Revolution to the Alamo to Iwo Jima, our nation's favorite stories of the past venerate militaristic heroism and bold defiance over appeasement and retreat. Recently, however, our admiration for defensive militarism has transformed into a pressing call for individual do-it-yourself security citizenship. The defensively armed citizen has become, in some quarters, the paragon of patriotism. Perception is everything. If we live in a world full of terrorists, violent criminals, and, quote, illegal immigrants, with a government unwilling or unable to protect us, we law-abiding citizens must take matters into our own hands. Yet our nation's past exclusions, ones that ensured that white, propertied men held a monopoly on lethal violence, continue to haunt the way we distribute the rights of self-defense in the present. We might observe the lopsided distribution of DIY security and the rapid spread of stand your ground laws. First passed in Florida in 2005, stand your ground laws allow civilians who perceive themselves to be in imminent danger to use lethal force without first trying to escape to safety. The laws grant special immunities to those who claim self-defense after killing someone as long as, quote, the person using or threatening to use the deadly force is not engaged in a criminal activity and is in a place where he or she has a right to be, end quote. On their surface, stand your ground laws provide legal justification and criminal immunity to any person who uses deadly force in self-defense. There is significant variation among state stand your ground laws, but all of them emphasize the right to use lethal force when one experiences what a, quote, reasonable person would consider a threat, even if the person could safely retreat from the perceived danger. Another key characteristic common to stand your ground laws is their emphasis on each person's right to defend oneself and property from criminal violation. Proponents of the laws aim to absolve law-abiding, quote-unquote, citizens of all criminal responsibility when they respond lethally to a perceived threat. However, as we've seen with the tragic death of Trayvon Martin, an unarmed Black 17-year-old gunned down by an armed citizen in a Florida suburb in 2012, perceptions of threat are in the eye of the beholder. Defensive lethal violence by armed citizens shares a historical genealogy with contemporary police violence, in that the usual targets are most commonly people of color. In 2014, police officers gunned down 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, and 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, because they perceived them, in the moment, as imminent threats. Emphasis on imminent. Neither possessed weapons, but police justified their force as necessary in the name of self-defense and the protection of the community, quote unquote. In these cases, as in many others, police violence against people of color takes root in the implicit biases of the larger culture. If Black men are widely perceived as intrinsically dangerous, they do not need to be armed to be seen as a threat to public safety. But what happens when people of color, in response to the pressures of these social biases and being subject to their repeating violence, emulate the ideals of DIY security by arming themselves and standing their ground? White suspicions of Black criminality on one hand and urgent lethal self-defense on the other allow little space for people of color to serve in the growing army of DIY security citizens. In July 2016, within a day of one another, 2 Black men in 2 different cities were killed by police. Both men were armed, following the mantra of today's armed citizen, but neither resisted arrest or made a move to use his weapon. In fact, 32-year-old Philando Castile of Minnesota explained to the police who pulled him over for a broken taillight that he was carrying a concealed firearm for which he had a permit. As he tried to extract his license from his pocket, the police opened fire through his car window, killing him in front of his girlfriend and 4-year-old child. In this case, it did not matter that Castile was a law-abiding citizen following the principles of armed citizenship so beloved in this United States. No. Or that he was complying peaceably with police orders. In the eyes of the police who killed him, his Blackness excluded him from the category of law-abiding citizenship. This was not the first time that had happened, and it likely will not be the last. According to historian Robin D.G. Kelly, from our nation's very founding, quote, predators and threats to white privileges were almost always black, brown, and red. A selective right to lethal self-defense, one that privileged white, straight men had access to because of their power and their property, accompanied this nation's founding in white European settler colonialism and slavery. The exclusion of non-whites and all women from the promises of democracy shapes our seemingly egalitarian ideals of DIY security citizenship today. Our contemporary understandings of law-abiding citizenship and criminality are neither gender neutral nor colorblind, and self-defense is not a de facto universal human right. In spite of gun advocates' claims that an armed citizenry and robust self-defense laws deter crime, states with stand your ground laws have seen a significant increase in homicides. Further, the language of these laws promises self-defense rights to everyone, but stand your ground laws are commonly and repeatedly adjudicated through the lens of our society's implicit racial and gender biases. The deck is disproportionately stacked against non-white men who are more likely to be perceived as, quote, reasonable threats, even when they are unarmed. Crime statistics from the past decade reveal that stand your ground laws have exacerbated racial discrepancies in the adjudication of self-defense. Whites who kill blacks in states with stand your ground laws are more than 11 times more likely to escape conviction than blacks who kill whites, 11 times more likely to escape conviction. The disproportionate number of black people killed and white people exonerated implicates our legal terrain's complicity in promoting a, quote, reasonable suspicion of non-white strangers who venture into predominantly white space. According to the journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates, quote, the logic of stand your ground laws incentivizes an armed citizenry where the beneficiary of justice is simply the last man standing. Your side of the story is irrelevant if you are dead. Trayvon Martin was never able to tell his side of the story, and his shooter was exonerated based on widespread perceptions and the presumed reasonableness of those perceptions that black men and boys are dangerous. Only for certain citizens are the terms reasonable threats sufficiently urgent. Likewise, female victims of straight domestic violence and gender nonconforming individuals subject to homophobic and transphobic attacks not only find themselves disproportionately vulnerable to violence, but also find the legal protections of enhanced self-defense laws stubbornly elusive. In spite of widespread claims to gender equality, the reality of gender continues to influence contemporary perceptions of threat and claims to self-defense. As witnessed in cases of women using violence to fend off attacks from intimate male partners and gender nonconforming individuals fighting back against attackers, standing your ground remains a masculine cisgender act. AKA, straight white men can do it, you cannot. Women and gender nonconforming people who invoke stand your ground laws to fend off violence face an uphill battle in court that is not similarly faced by white men doing the same. In the words of legal scholar Mary Ann Frank, stand your ground laws ensure that, quote, real men advance while real women have to retreat. Given our present association of DIY security with good citizenship, one might suppose that the United States has always been a, quote, shoot first, ask questions later type of nation. But in fact, we have not been. Not even close. If anything I just said, you were like, wait, back up, what? I'm going to get into it. I'm going to get the fuck into it. On the night of Wednesday, August 9th, 2006, John White, a 53-year-old asphalt company laborer, shot and killed 17-year-old Daniel Chicoro Jr. on the front lawn of John's house in suburban Miller Place, Long Island. While the events that precipitated the shooting remain clouded in controversy, it is uncontested that earlier that evening, Daniel had argued violently with John's teenage son, Aaron. After learning from a friend's sister that she thought Aaron intended to rape her, Daniel, 17-year-old Daniel, had gone into a drunken rage, had threatened Aaron over the phone, and had driven with 4 friends, one armed with a baseball bat, to John's house. The elder John left his house armed with a pistol and shot Daniel after a heated, profanity-laced exchange. There was no allegation that Daniel produced a weapon, and unlike more than 20 other states, New York does not have an expansive Castle Doctrine of self-defense on which John could rely. In other words, in New York, the fact that 17-year-old Daniel threateningly entered John's property without permission did not grant John a prima facie right to resort to deadly force. As a result, John's defense rested on convincing a Suffolk County jury that he reasonably feared for his own and his family's safety. John had good reason to feel threatened, his attorney insisted, in large part because of his race. Unlike 99.5% of the population of Miller Place, and unlike Daniel and his friends, John was Black. Even more important in the eyes of the defense was the fact that John's ancestors had been chased from their Alabama home by members of the KKK, causing John to associate the aggressive incursion of white men with a legacy of intense racial violence. Rooted firmly in this narrative of racial conflict and raising questions of how integrated Long Island really was, the trial attracted tremendous media coverage and public attention at that time in 2006. Daniel's friends and family demanded vengeance and loudly denounced the allegations that race had played a significant role in the confrontation and homicide. In John's defense, civil rights activists led by Reverend Al Sharpton decried what they viewed as an attempted modern-day lynching, while advocates of gun rights and self-defense claimed that John had been acting in the necessary defense of his and his family's lives and honor. In 2007, John was ultimately convicted of manslaughter by a jury with 1 Black member and sentenced to a prison term of 2 to 4 years, which he has already served and been released. Starting with this case is not intended to imply that the Castle Doctrine would have led to John's exoneration. Not at all. Actually, there is a mound of evidence to show that the prosecution could have actually successfully refuted that defense if it would have been available under New York law, because there was proof that Daniel wasn't actually physically standing on his property at the time that he was fatally shot. This case is not intended to sway you in either direction. Really, there are no 2 directions to be swayed. This is not a black and white situation. This case I am telling you about simply to demonstrate as a starting point how complex the issue of self-defense is, especially when it comes to your home or your property or your family, etc. That case also highlights the racial, gender, cultural, and political conflicts and unexpected alliances that the debate over the application of the Castle Doctrine and self-defense and stand your ground evokes. Self-defense seems to be a natural law, one that has existed for all of human history. Mosaic law of the Bible permitted defending one's home if a thief broke in during the night. The person striking him bore no blood guilt if the thief died from the blow. During the late Roman Republic, Cicero asserted that self-defense is a, quote, law which we were not taught, but to which we were made. end quote, and that every means of securing our safety is honorable. The English incorporated self-defense into its common law, which, as I stated, the U.S. copied and pasted into its own legal system. William Blackstone emphasized, quote, a man's limbs, or at least those members which may be useful to him fight, as the gift of the wise creator. Bop, bop. An injury to these exalted limbs constituted a, quote, manifest breach of civil liberty. Protection of life and limb therefore became the ultimate protection of liberty itself. The U.S. Constitution does not recognize or grant such a right to self-defense, neither in its body nor in its amendments. Such right has been read in implicitly. Common law self-defense requires a person to retreat, if possible, before fending off an attacker with deadly force. When no safe retreat exists, retreat is not required when an unsafe retreat exists, and the person has, quote, retreated to the wall. Force, including deadly force, may then be used to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm. Makes sense, right? In no way, shape, or form has self-defense law, even back in the 1600s, okay, 1700s, when we came over on those fucking godforsaken goddamn boats, all right, and started our own little country, okay, at no point were self-defense laws ever anything but, yeah, no, like if you cannot get the fuck out of there safely and someone's trying to threaten you, right, is definitely using force or threat of force, or you have a reasonable belief that you are about to be forced, okay, that's going to be injuring you greatly, immensely, injuring someone else greatly or immensely, okay, great bodily injury, great bodily harm, or death, okay, even if it's just, oh, like the reasonable belief or fear that that's going to happen to you, yeah, of course you can use that proportional force to defend yourself, even if it means fatal force. No, for sure. At no time was that ever controversial, okay? That's self-defense law, okay? That's like biblical time-ass self-defense law. The normal, regular caveat that we've always had in there, back foundational time type beat, okay, has been that you have an affirmative duty to retreat if you can safely do so, okay? You have a duty to get the fuck out of there so that we don't have an entire nation filled with vigilante justicers, okay? Vigilante people taking the law into their own hands and not trusting our legal system, our laws, our court system, whatever, to enact the vengeance that you didn't really have to use or like take into your own hands in that instance, right? That is why that is there, because we value human life over property, quote unquote. That is not my opinion. It is, but like not my opinion. It's been a fact and principle of law, okay? Written by the founding fizzies, all right? If you give a fuck about them, I don't, but if y'all care, founding fizzies, all right, founding fizzy times, we were like, no, yeah, like obviously, you know what I mean? Like, even if it's like a petty, whatever, even if someone's like, about, like, whatever, you're going to fight all that, threat for whatever. If you have the ability to safely retreat, you have a duty to do so, because very few crimes in the United States of A come with a punishment of death or great bodily harm, right? That's just a fact. So like odds fucking are, okay? The person who's going to be in trouble from like trying to, from scaring the bejesus out of you and like about to commit a crime against you, great bodily harm, all that, yeah, they're going to go away for the time that they need to for doing those things. You shouldn't immediately have the absolute right to kill that person simply because you had a belief, reasonably, that you were potentially going to be injured, going to be harmed greatly, or like this person was trying to kill you, right? Like you have a duty to retreat if there's a safe way to do it. If there's no safe way to do it, okay, or even if, right, like in the moment, it's all the standard of a reasonable person. We're not going to judge you in an imminent, fast, second by second moment by a standard of a person who like has 20/20 vision and is able to, go in slow-mo and go, well, you see, like the phone was right next to you. If you didn't know the phone was right next to you, you didn't know that, there was a window open, you didn't know the door was open, you thought the door was locked, like that is all taken into that's all subjective and that's all okay. Okay. We are allowed to take that into context. Okay. But like, for example, if you are in a car that's running, okay, in the driver's seat, okay, at a stoplight, and someone gets out of their car and starts banging on your window with a crowbar and the light goes green, you have an affirmative duty to retreat, right? Under the common law, under many states' laws still to this day, but there's a caveat to that now, right? You have the duty to like drive away and like call law enforcement, have them fucking handle it, right? You do not, okay, in that instance, it would not have been reasonable for you, okay, where there was a safe way for you to retreat, for you to throw it in park, hit the e-brake, roll down your window, and shoot the person in the head 4 times. Do you understand why that is? Yes, that person's for sure committing battery assault, like for sure. They're attempted carjacking, definitely, right? List of charges, okay, that have any kind of consequences that involve the death penalty. I don't know, not at that juncture, but even so, right? It's not your job in a 5-second time span to be the judge of that. You have an affirmative duty to get the fuck out of there, okay? Under the common law, all right? Which is what they teach everyone in law school, okay? The starting off point for self-defense is, okay, so like this is the general common law rule. The common law rule meaning like this is the general rule. These are all the fucking caveats to it, okay? So let's start from there. When Thomas Selfridge stood trial for manslaughter in December 1806, the young nation's laws were vague on the topic of lethal self-defense. The 32-year-old lawyer had killed a man in the streets of Boston, claiming he did so to protect himself from grave danger. The English common law, on which the United States' legal foundations were and are still based, held that one must retreat, in the face of an attack and not retaliate until, quote, retreating as far as he conveniently or safely can. The taking of another's life was among the most serious of crimes, one commonly punishable by death. Yet in the United States, the idea of backing away from a threat or of allowing the state to protect one from harm clashed with the ideals of independence and individual rights on which the nation was founded. While legal doctrine upheld a duty to retreat, popular opinion in the young republic increasingly saw a white man's retreat from an assault, particularly an assault to his honor, as cowardly and incompatible with the values of a liberal democracy. Under English common law, the right of protecting citizens and of punishing wrongs was reserved for the crown, the government, right? If one were attacked or threatened, the king and his laws, not the individual, would avenge the injury. Under English common law, one was obligated, therefore, to retreat if threatened rather than respond with lethal violence. We copied and pasted our American legal system from the English common law, okay, the English system. If the laws and the system works the way it's supposed to, you will have your day in court, okay? Because we don't want to encourage vigilante justice. We don't want to encourage lawlessness. Why, you may ask? Because everyone has tried it and it never works the fuck out, okay? It's terrifying to live in a society like that. It was and is, okay? When at any time, justice can be dealt severely and swiftly, instead of people all collectively saying, okay, we cannot, right, at any threat of violence to ourselves, at any, right, during any instance, we cannot suddenly decide that we can take the law into our own hands, and that's our right to do as American citizens, okay? This was like a very obvious principle that everyone in America agreed upon. We were like, yeah, that would be redonkulous, right? If we just let people do that, right. The chief exception to the English duty to retreat was the Castle Doctrine, which originated in a 1604 case involving an officer of the crown who had forcibly entered the home of a man named Semaine. Delivering the opinion in Semaine's case, Attorney General Sir Edward Coke established the principle that officers seeking entry into a private dwelling must first announce themselves before entering. When was this? 1604. According to Coke, quote, "The house of everyone is to him as his castle and fortress, as well for his defense against injury and violence as for his repose." This decision popularized the expression still used today, quote, "A man's house is his castle," end quote. The Castle Doctrine, you will finally learn what that is, thank God. The Castle Doctrine augmented common law self-defense, removing any duty to retreat when someone is attacked in their home. The doctrine did not just allow a person to respond with force if being attacked in their home, but it also allowed a person to use force, including deadly force, to protect the property itself. That idea seeped into American law through cases like Irwin versus Ohio, which chided the Old English, quote, "cowardice" of retreat and coalesced into the more formal version of the Castle Doctrine as recognized in the case of Beard. In Beard versus United States, a Supreme Court case from 1895. That's right, 1895. The Castle Doctrine's old as hell, okay? In Beard, the Supreme Court reversed a manslaughter conviction because the jury was improperly instructed that a defendant had a duty to retreat from the advancement of an aggressor on his own property. A few years later in 1914, a very famous New York Court of Appeals judge, Benjamin Cardozo, eloquently explained the Castle Doctrine in his holding in People versus Tomlins, revealing the universality and the timelessness of the doctrine while also highlighting the ridiculousness of basically forcing someone to make a from-home retreat. Okay, quote, "It is not now and never has been the law that a man assailed in his own dwelling is bound to retreat. If assailed there, he may stand his ground and resist the attack. He is under no duty to take to the fields and the highways a fugitive from his own home." The Tomlins court cited Beard as the standard for the settled law of self-defense and the Castle Doctrine in the United States. The Castle Doctrine is an exception to the duty to retreat, which is a restriction on self-defense, so long as the other requirements of the defense are met, which we will get into. Okay, there are elements, okay, that have to be satisfied. You can't just cry self-defense and there's a dead body on your floor, all right? You need to prove some shit, all right? Don't worry. You can use force, proportional to protect your home, where you sleep, where you eat, where you dwell, your dwelling home, not your commercial real estate, all right? Not your fucking job, all right? No, your home, your dwelling home. That is what the Castle Doctrine applied to, okay? The Castle Doctrine's protections, however, started bleeding into other places outside of the home, including the larger confines of a home's property, the workplace, and ultimately the public. The boundary of requiring a duty to retreat stayed in circumstances where the alleged assailant also had a legal right to be. But the Castle Doctrine got messy quickly and still gets messy today when situations of conflicting rights to be in a location overlap. This is especially evident in domestic violence situations, which we are going to get into. Stand your ground laws extend the Castle Doctrine to the public realm, which, if you think about it, is crazy. Unlike the common law doctrines, laws, principles of self-defense and the Castle Doctrine, stand your ground laws are new as fuck. No matter what the NRA tries to tell you about how these are ancient, archaic, like founding faith, no. Stand your ground laws did not fucking exist, okay? They didn't. This concept was not a thing in the minds of our people, okay? Stand your ground laws, in effect, extend the Castle Doctrine to the public realm, saying that individuals who encounter a threat in a public place need not retreat, but instead can meet force with force, still proportionally. Stand your ground laws are essentially a revocation of the duty to retreat. In the last 2 decades, more than 30 states have adopted some version of stand your ground laws. Most of these were passed from 2005 to 2011. Police agencies and prosecutors have mostly opposed these laws, while organizations such as the NRA have advocated for their passage. This shift began with Florida in 2005 when the state legislature adopted an aggressive version of this law that gave significant legal protections to those who claimed it as a defense. Florida's prior legal standard was safe retreat. After George Zimmerman was acquitted of fatally shooting and killing young teenager Trayvon Martin, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder affirmatively condemned stand your ground laws, declaring, quote, "These laws try to fix something that was never broken. It's time to question laws that senselessly expand the concept of self-defense and sow dangerous conflict. Such laws undermine public safety. We must take a hard look at laws that contribute to more violence than they prevent," end quote. Do they senselessly expand the already very steady, very principled doctrine and defense of self-defense? Are they an unnecessary expansion? Do they indeed try to fix something that was never broken? You can decide for yourself. For those of you watching on YouTube, you can tell it is indeed a new day. I did indeed take a break from recording to sleep. Woke up, put on makeup, same makeup, and the same jacket. We're back at it. Hello, welcome back. As I already stated and emphasized, every jurisdiction in the United States already recognized and still recognizes an individual's right to use force, including deadly force, in self-protection. Self-defense, which is considered a justification defense, has several elements. At common law, a non-aggressor, so the person who is being attacked, is justified in using deadly force upon another if he reasonably believes such force is necessary to protect himself from imminent use of unlawful deadly force by another person. This rule contains three principal elements. First is necessity. Second is proportionality, and third is reasonable belief. The element of necessity is often transformed into an element of imminence, okay? The threat that is coming at you is not tomorrow, it's not in 1 hour, it's not in 10 minutes, it's not even in another 2 minutes. It is imminent, it is right now. You need to protect yourself with deadly force right now at this very moment, imminently and immediately. This is an important legal distinction in many areas of both civil and criminal law, but specifically for self-defense, okay? You cannot use quote-unquote self-defense, deadly force self-defense in a situation where the threat to you is even a few seconds after what a reasonable person would believe is imminent. Perfect. Glad you got that. The necessity element requires that force, including deadly force, should only be used to the extent that it is necessary. The underlying principle behind necessity as it relates to deadly force is that all human life, even the life of a violent criminal, is valuable and worthy of protection. Accordingly, having the right to use force that is capable of killing another human being should be reserved only for those situations in which a person being attacked has no other alternatives. Under the common law, force is only considered necessary when confronted with an imminent or immediate threat. This rule precludes a preemptive attack even if it appears an impending threat is inevitable. The necessity element also precludes the use of deadly force to combat an imminent deadly assault if a non-deadly response would be sufficient to repel the attack. Lastly, and most controversially, the necessity element in some jurisdictions does not allow the use of deadly force against an attacker when there is a completely safe avenue of retreat. The second element, proportionality. The proportionality element places a limit on the maximum amount of force that one may use to protect oneself. The amount of force used to protect oneself must not be excessive in relation to the harm with which one is threatened. For example, in a common law jurisdiction, a person may not use deadly force to protect his or her property, even if deadly force was the only way to prevent the property from being stolen or damaged. The proportionality element reflects the societal value that it would be a great injustice to allow one to use deadly force against someone committing a non-violent offense, such as trespassing, theft, or vandalism. Next element, the last element, okay? Reasonable belief. The reasonable belief element in self-defense law contains both a subjective and an objective inquiry. The first question is whether the actor subjectively believed that deadly force was necessary to repel an imminent unlawful attack. The second question is whether the actor's belief was one that a reasonable person in his same situation would have possessed. This objective view of a subjective state of mind standard means that an individual may satisfy this element even if later it turns out that the threat was not in fact imminent or there was a completely safe avenue of retreat. This reasonable person standard, okay, is the bread and butter of the legal field. You will hear the term reasonable person, reasonable belief, an objectively reasonable person 8 million fucking times in law school, in life, right, in practice, everywhere. Today, a majority of jurisdictions have eliminated the duty to retreat and allow one to use deadly force even if he knows he can retreat in complete safety. However, a sizable minority still adheres to the common law rule that requires retreat when there is a known and safe place to escape to. Supporters of the duty to retreat argue that it is an essential component of the necessity element, of the imminence element. If one is confronted with deadly force but knows for certain that he can escape the altercation, then using deadly force against his attacker is not truly necessary. Supporters also point out that the rule does not increase the risk of harm to innocent people because retreating is only required when one is both subjectively aware of a place of complete safety and also believes that they can actually retreat with safety, okay? So it's not just about knowing that there's an avenue there. It's also about your, in split-second moment, your objectively reasonable belief that you could even retreat safely, okay? So like, if you really think about it, the application of someone really not having the self-against, right? I mean, in theory, okay, the fair and unbiased and not racist and not sexist application of the duty to retreat would logically mean that people who do indeed engage in lethal self-defense, but they are justified in doing so, even if there is technically a safe way to retreat. The duty to retreat element shouldn't be a bar to people using this defense in a way that makes sense, okay? It's not like a complete, like, get out of jail free card all the time. Like, oftentimes it allows you to plead down to manslaughter. Like, it allows you to not be, up for fucking second-degree murder, felony murder, etc. It's like, it's not what everyone thinks it is, right? Of like, oh, we're scot-free and free to go. Like, no, like someone still died, right? Like, that's a big deal. We, of course, want to allow for justifiable homicide when the situation absolutely calls for it. Supporters of the no retreat rule argue that the law should be in accordance with the behavior of reasonable men. And I will touch on this more later, but please note the use of the word man. Okay? Language is important. Terminology is important. Verbiage is indeed important, no matter what anyone tells you. In the law, it is important. The way that we have described things, the way that we have laid out these standards has always been in the masculine. As I explained, the history, okay, of having the duty to retreat kind of erode was based upon this idea that manly men don't run. Quite literally, absolutely men don't run. Men, not women, not black men, not people of color. White men don't run. America. Oh, say, can you see? By the dawn's early light, flag still standing, right? Well, maybe the flag should have been taken down for a minute. Holy shit. A rule that discourages the, quote, manly response of standing one's ground by requiring the cowardly, quote unquote, act of retreat conflicts with our society's values of bravery and standing up for oneself. Another argument is that a no retreat rule deters violent crime because criminals are now put on notice that innocent civilians can fight back. Incorrect when actually applied. Supporters of the no retreat rule also claim that a no retreat rule instills confidence in law-abiding citizens and lets them know that in the event they find themselves in a life-threatening situation, the law will support their decision to defend themselves rather than second-guess it. Finally, supporters of this rule argue that a duty to retreat, quote unquote, is an archaic doctrine that has no place in a modern society with firearms. Right. Ultimately, in my opinion, and in the view of many legal scholars and people who have actually done the research on this, and those who have seen these stand your ground laws in practice, they believe that stand your ground laws unnecessarily twist self-defense into an entirely new creature. Injecting immunity and the presumption of a reasonable imminent threat into the law removes the line between self-protection and vigilantism, allowing anyone to assume that harm is about to befall them and they should take the first shot. The law promises to deter would-be murderers and thieves by putting them on notice and giving the intended victims the right to defend themselves against such marauders. In reality, increased homicide rates and inconsistent application of the Stand Your Ground statutes allow murderers to get away with, well, murder. At best, the law incentivizes killing unnecessarily, justifying a culture of kill or be killed vigilantism where the last man standing gets the benefit regardless of actual circumstances. Stand Your Ground adds nothing to existing self-defense laws. Justification for homicide already exists in all jurisdictions already and has since the Middle Ages. Removing retreat to justify using force begs for aggression to run unchecked. Removing imminence in this self-defense structure collapses it entirely. And it all, unfortunately, comes back to race. Imminence is the foundation of self-defense. Without it, defensive reactions become crimes. Removing it allows space for other components to slip in, filling in the factual gaps to make a situation look like self-defense and not something more sinister. These elements include racism, the presence of a gun, or even the chemicals flowing in our brains. When not properly accountable to imminence, the justification for force disintegrates. As a component of Stand Your Ground legislation, race cannot be overstated and must be analyzed as both a separate component and as a facet of the other factors. Racial stereotypes affect how the human brain subconsciously perceives a threat and determines what reaction to take. Our minds form implicit biases by processing information quickly and automatically using mental shortcuts. It is something we do that we simply cannot not do. That process is not infallible, of course. Racial stereotypes, especially those reinforced by media coverage that overrepresents Black and Latino people as criminals, embed themselves into the collective consciousness, making our subconscious decisions subject to these inaccuracies. In fact, the Black as criminal, quote-unquote, stereotype is so ubiquitous that science long ago confirmed the existence of a pervasive, unconscious, and largely automatic bias against dark-skinned individuals as more hostile, criminal, and prone to violence. And that is pulled directly from an empirical study cited in the article Weaponized Racial Fear by Sean E. Fields. These built-in biases permeate the minds of police, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and juries, as well as the minds of the public consuming the cases through media coverage. Statistically, homicides in Stand Your Ground law states are 65% more likely to be ruled justified than in non-Stand Your Ground states. When analyzed by race, homicides with a white perpetrator and a Black victim are ruled justified over 16% of the time, while only just over 1% are justified when a Black perpetrator shoots a white victim and uses the same defense. Statistics cannot paint the entire picture because many incidents do not make it past the call to the police. In Florida, law enforcement, police officers that on average in the entire country have 10 to 12 weeks of training total to learn the guns, the maneuvers, the driving, the chat, and also, the law they're supposed to enforce with a deadly weapon. They are charged with determining whether a perpetrator is immune from criminal proceedings, including arrest at the scene of the incident, without investigation, without a lawyer looking at all the evidence and determining, actually, no, this person had no right and reason to use justifiable deadly force. This was not justified at all. Yeah, they say it was, but we have a body on the ground and one person standing to tell their story. Let's see if the evidence links up. No, in Florida, the police officers who arrive on the scene, who got all C's in high school, are charged with determining whether this person won't be arrested at all. As many of you may know, and if you don't, here it is. The self-defense defense does not get you out of arrest, charging, potentially prosecution. No, it does not. Okay? Thankfully, because we do have this system called the system that, yes, even if you are completely justified in using self-defense, absolutely, there is a body on the ground, right? There's a body on the ground or someone severely maimed on the ground. Even if you can absolutely show and prove that your self-defense defense was righteous and justifiable and you satisfied all the elements of the self-defense defense, you still have to prove that, right? Like we should definitely hold everyone to the standard of, yeah, no, if there's a body on the ground in our society, we care about human life enough and are worried about people getting away with murder enough that we are going to at least make sure that we look into it, right? Self-defense is not a bar from going through the process. Self-defense is simply the defense that you put on in order to justify your actions after the fact. It may indeed mean that the prosecution, after considering all the evidence and after, arresting you, whatever, charging you, they decide to drop the charges because, they don't want to go to trial with this because they're like, yeah, no, completely justified self-defense, totally. But sometimes, right, there is a trial. There's a full murder trial, okay? The prosecution's like, no, we want you to go away. There's a body on the ground. And you put on the defense of self-defense and a jury can very well determine and go, yeah, justified. Absolutely. We looked at the evidence. We heard from you. We heard from everyone. Saw it all, okay? And yes, indeed, you are acquitted, justified, okay? That is how it should be. We shouldn't let beauty school dropout fucking police officers pull up to a fucking scene of a crime, see a very commonly black or brown person on the ground, dead or severely injured, a white guy standing up and going, yeah, he came at me, and them making a judgment call right there and going, yeah, you're good, and not even arrest them. Like, do you understand why Florida's stand your ground law? It's not, stand your ground, patriotism, my rights, babes. What in the actual fuck? You've never not had the right to self-defense. Stand your ground laws did nothing new. It did nothing new. All it did was remove all of the safeguards that we could possibly have for ensuring that people aren't getting away with fucking shooting first, asking questions later, and doing it because they know that if one person's dead, they're going to believe my story. Amazing. Not only do imminence and necessity get muddled, but the objective and subjective components make analysis confusing. In 1986, in New York City, a white man, Bernard Goetz, was approached on the subway by a group of 4 young black men who asked him for $5. Goetz pulled out a handgun and fired, injuring all 4. Goetz, after sustaining an injury while being mugged several years prior, carried a firearm with him, anticipating the need to defend himself. Merely displaying the weapon successfully deterred other attackers since the first incident. That fateful day on the subway, however, Goetz instead chose not to display the gun, but to just fire the gun at the 4 black teenagers. The charges against Goetz were dismissed because of an instruction to the grand jury to consider whether Goetz's behavior was that of a reasonable man, which Goetz argued erroneously introduced an objective element to a standard that should be wholly subjective, basically should wholly consider his own biases in the moment. The confusion nearly brought down the case. However, the New York Court of Appeals reversed and reinstated the charges based on the extensive case law and legislative history's indication that reasonable was the objective standard. What would an objectively reasonable do in this situation? knowing everything that they knew. They would not have shot fucking first. That's for goddamn sure. Even if they were mugged previously, why were you flashing it to everyone and suddenly 4 black teenagers you decided to just fire first? Do you see what I'm saying? Amazing. Unfortunately for Goetz and many others, carrying and using a weapon in anticipation of self-defense is not a discrete doctrine identified by courts. Anticipatory self-defense is mostly expressed in connection with battered women syndrome in domestic violence cases and international military conflicts. Its use in self-defense cases is generally unsuccessful. The concept of anticipatory self-defense, however, threads through the analysis of imminence. At what point does the anticipation of an attack become an imminent attack? When the duty to retreat no longer exists. In the case law and statute under the law in Florida, for example, imminence becomes more significant and more subjective. When one stands their ground, personal judgment on when to meet force becomes really the only factor in determining imminence, which is wild. The imminence element in self-defense cases usually operates as the objectively reasonable portion of the determination that the defendant had a subjective belief that deadly force was necessary. The threat must be both imminent and the force countering it must be necessary. The would-be victim must possess an objectively reasonable belief in the imminence of such threat, whether the threat is actually present or only perceived as present. Imminence and necessity often present as two sides of the same coin and may seem difficult to separate. They can be unwound, but still do interact. The defensive use of force cannot be anticipatory. Imminence and necessity act as restraints to ensure that self-defense stays within the bounds of justification. Because again, the idea of self-defense being used as a defense to murder or assault and battery is all related to whether it's justified. Are you justified in doing what would have otherwise been a very serious crime? The passage of the nation's first stand your ground law originated with a deadly encounter in Pensacola, Florida. In the early morning hours of November 2nd, 2004, 56-year-old Kathy Workman and her 77-year-old husband James were awakened by a noise outside. The white retirees were staying in a FEMA trailer after Hurricane Ivan had wrecked their home, and they looked out the window to see a stranger wandering through their yard. After the stranger failed to respond when the couple hailed him from their window, James grabbed his .38 caliber handgun and headed outside. Kathy called 911. It is not clear why 35-year-old Rodney Cox, a white contractor working temporarily for FEMA, was on the Workman's property in the middle of the night. He had called 911 earlier in the evening, disoriented and confused, claiming to have witnessed a domestic disturbance a few miles away. No one knows what brought him to the Workman's yard that night or what provoked him to enter the couple's trailer after James confronted him. The 911 dispatcher's recording captured Kathy's panicked voice pleading for police assistance, then her screams in response to a scuffle between her husband and Cox, then gunshots. At the hospital, Cox was pronounced dead on arrival. He was also found to have a mysterious skull fracture, which may explain his erratic behavior. James Workman was never arrested, but he and Kathy waited anxiously for the state to decide whether he was culpable in the killing of an unarmed man. Had the case gone to court, a jury would likely have perceived Workman's fear of Cox as reasonable. The shooting took place inside the couple's FEMA trailer, an extension of their castle, their home, the Castle Doctrine, in application, at night and following reports of multiple home break-ins. Yet Cox had not been armed, and it was unclear whether his behavior was considered immediately threatening. Ultimately, the Attorney General's office concluded on January 30th, 2005, that the killing had been justifiable, exonerating James of any guilt. That case is the pinnacle for a case where the Castle Doctrine, right? The fact that the duty to retreat does not apply when you are in your home is fair, right? So when you think about it, when these types of cases have that type of outcome, okay, what cases were the NRA and these far-right politicians pointing to say that Florida needed stand your ground when it had never been done before in the way that they wanted to do it in the most batshit bonkers way? What were they saying was a travesty? What was the carriage of justice here in the state. There was none. Self-defense, the law, the principle, the defense of self-defense was being applied the way it should and the way it was written, right? They decided to make shit up, right? Of course they did. On the night of November 5th, 2004, Jimmy Morningstar, a 43-year-old cable salesman, was planning on having an enjoyable evening in Palm Beach, Florida. This was the first night of a 2-week vacation from work, and he decided to celebrate the occasion at the local alehouse. While at the bar, Morningstar drank heavily and became intoxicated to the point that he was cut off from further drinks and was asked to leave. Morningstar, who was described that night as unruly, refused to leave. A bar employee, presumably trying to both convince Morningstar to leave and also make sure he reached home safely, called him a cab. The cab driver, Robert Smiley, arrived at the bar and drove Morningstar to his apartment, which was less than a mile away. Upon arriving at the apartment, Morningstar refused to get out. Smiley then forcibly removed him by zapping him with a stun gun. Although it is unclear exactly what transpired after this, it appears that Morningstar, who was now outside of the taxi, tried to get back in. Smiley, who had a firearm, responded by first yelling at Morningstar, then firing 2 warning shots, and finally shooting him twice in the chest, killing him. Smiley later testified at trial that Morningstar flashed a knife, but one was never found. On October 1st, 2005, less than 1 year after Smiley killed Morningstar, and while the case was still pending, the Florida legislature passed the new bill that significantly altered the state's self-defense laws. This bill, called the Protection of Person/Use of Force Bill, is known as the original expansive Stand Your Ground law. Robert Smiley, who eventually pled guilty to manslaughter after 2 mistrials, waged a lengthy legal battle in which he moved the court to permit jury instructions based on the newly enacted Stand Your Ground law. Although his motion was ultimately denied, a Florida District Court of Appeal acknowledged that if Smiley did not have a duty to retreat, quote, it would substantially affect the legal consequences attached to Smiley's conduct. The implication being, of course, that if Smiley had done the same act just a year later after the passage of the new bill, he may have been legally justified in his use of deadly force. The Jimmy Morningstar Robert Smiley incident factually illustrates the real-life problems with the Stand Your Ground law. The law explicitly allows one to stand his ground and use deadly force even if, for example, the individual could escape with complete certainty. Smiley, the cab driver, likely had a completely safe avenue of retreat once he had forced Morningstar out of his cab. He could have driven away. Morningstar, who at this point was extremely intoxicated and likely still recovering from being tased, was unarmed and standing in the road. All Smiley had to do to defuse the situation was to drive away. It is difficult to imagine a jury would find that Smiley reasonably believed shooting Morningstar was necessary to protect his life as required by the common law. One simple way to show that the act was unnecessary is to show Smiley had the opportunity to safely retreat. Florida's new law, however, explicitly prevents courts from even considering this. Instead, the jury instruction might say something like, if Robert Smiley was not engaged in an unlawful activity and was attacked in any place where he had a right to be, he had no duty to retreat and had the right to stand his ground and meet force with force, including deadly force, if he reasonably believed that it was necessary to do so to prevent death or great bodily harm to himself or another or to prevent the commission of a forcible felony. While a jury might find Smiley guilty under these instructions, the inclusion of the phrase, he had no duty to retreat and had the right to stand his ground and meet force with force, as well as the jury's inability to even consider whether he could have retreated, certainly could have impacted the outcome. This is especially troubling because it defies common sense. What better proof is there that Smiley's act of shooting Morningstar was not necessary than the fact that he could have easily driven away from the situation? Simply put, if Smiley could have safely retreated, then the threat would not be imminent. And so no force would be needed and no one would be hurt. Imminence only exists because the refusal to retreat falsely creates it. I repeat, imminence only exists because the refusal to retreat falsely creates it. And again, for the whiners, I am not talking about situations. What if you can't safely retreat? What if you didn't know there was an option to retreat? What if do you think I'm talking about you? No. I hope I have weeded out by this point in the episode the morons. I can only pray. right? Use your brains. Use your brains. I shouldn't have to have a qualifier disclaimer after every fucking statement I make about a hyper-specific situation. Thank you. Since the Stand Your Ground Law's enactment, the court's speculation that this is probably sketchy has proved to be an accurate application of the law. In a 2009 Florida case similar to Smiley, Jimmy Hare, a passenger in a parked car, shot and killed Charles Harper, who had unlawfully entered the vehicle but was being pulled out by his friend. So getting in the wrong Uber. That's the scenario. And a friend going, no, that's not it, and pulling you out. That's the direct equivalent. Shot and killed immediately. Dismissing the charges based on Hare's writ of prohibition invoking stand your ground immunity, the court stated that even though Harper was retreating, quote, the statute makes no exception from the immunity when the victim is in retreat at the time the defensive force is employed. So if like your attacker retreats, if they're like, I'm out, and the attacker in this case just got in your car and like started leaving. Oh no, there's no exception. Yeah, no, you still have full immunity. Kill them. Kill them. Kill them. For example, if someone comes up to you, right, and is like maybe a bar fight situation and you flash like a gun or like you stand up and they realize you're 6'6" and huge and then they go, never mind, and start backing away. Yeah, no, you can now stab that person to death. Thanks, Florida. An imminent threat no longer existed. Yet Hare successfully used the stand your ground law to kill, pretty much indiscriminately. Imminence, according to the court, is not required even though it is explicit in the law. Insanity. Insanity. In another case clearly lacking imminence, a judge dismissed charges against Grayston Garcia, who claimed a stand your ground defense when Garcia, armed with a knife, chased a thief, Pedro Roteta, who was attempting to steal the radio from Garcia's truck, for a block before catching and stabbing him to death. There was no imminent threat to Garcia because he was asleep inside his apartment when Roteta stole the radio from Garcia's vehicle. Garcia had the time to grab a knife before going outside to confront Roteta, who then ran away. Garcia could have stayed safely inside, called the police, and let them handle it. However, he chose to dispense vigilante justice, and a man paid for a radio with his life. And we said, yes, you can kill someone indiscriminately at will, even though stealing, theft is not, we don't think should not carry with it a death sentence, but y'all can decide that. Do you see how the application of this law is doing literally fucking nothing for people who actually have self-defense claims? All the people who regularly already had defenses that were valid and justified were already going to use them and already going to get off and are going to be Gucci under regular self-defense laws because our nation has had them since literally the dawn of time. Biblical times. We've had self-defense be kosher. Yeah, no. Florida said, let me pause, do this bonker shit so that we can just have people kill at random. So long as there's just like a little asterisk. Honestly, serial killers might as well just prowl around Florida, wait to watch people try to prowl around shitty neighborhoods. You know what I mean? And just watch, just look for people trying to commit crimes and then just stab them to death. Literally chase them a block and stab them to death with no imminence at all. There was no force. There was no threat to that person. That case is fucking insane to me. Rest in peace to Pedro Roteta. Oh my God. That is nauseating. Nauseating. And, good news. It's not just Florida now. What is it? 30-something other states have already adopted standard gun laws. Amazing. Perfect. None as expansive as Florida, but is this good, do you think? Do you think this is good? No, it's not. Prosecutors, law enforcement, defense attorneys, judges, legal scholars, anyone with a brain in this field has across the board said these are fucking insane. That standard gun laws do nothing. Do nothing to fix what wasn't broken. It just makes it worse. It just makes everything worse. Self-defense is already a thing. This isn't creating a right that we didn't have. This isn't filling a gap that was already open. There was no gap. All you do in this instance is capitalize off of people's largely unreasonable fear of this faceless criminal that's going to pop out of the bushes and you're going to defend yourself and then be booked for murder. No one said that you would. Like, literally, self-defense laws already apply. You already would have been kosher. But no, we're just going to capitalize off of people's bullshit, gunshot, cash register noise, cawing eagle. Fucking patriotism means that we need to be armed and loaded, locked and loaded at all times vibe. And then it only results in bodies. That's all it results in. God bless America. Imminence was not considered in the Hare and Garcia cases, nor is it considered in many other stand your ground cases where a clear, safe retreat exists. The only difference between those cases and Smiley was that the law did indeed justify Hare and Garcia's behavior and not Smiley's, simply because Smiley's case happened before stand your ground was in place. Because of that justification, 2 men lost their lives without price and without a real reason. Both Hare and Garcia left their eventual victim to get a weapon with the intent to cause them harm and even possibly with the intent to kill them. And the law protected them. Removing the duty to retreat effectively removes imminence, leaving only the subjective belief of the person using force the ground to claim self-defense. In the Hare and Garcia cases, requiring imminence would have protected Harper and Roteta, or at least required payment for their lives. Without contemplating imminence in those cases, the law devalued the lives of those who died, who were killed. Wouldn't it apply the same to women, though? Like, what's the problem with that? Why wouldn't it apply to, for example, battered women, women who are victims of domestic violence? Isn't this great for them? Like, right? They can stand their ground. Like, they don't have to always run away from their attacker. Like, they can defend themselves, right? Like, they've always been able to defend themselves, but now, like, they really can stand their ground. Oh, we forgot. The law never protects battered women. Amazing, perfect, gorgeous. The Castle Doctrine has been frequently invoked and successfully used as a defense in cases that resemble the scenario of an intruder breaking into your home and a man defending their home. When the aggressor has been an intruder into the victim aggressor's home, the defense has seldom been challenged and, of course, is seen as a fair and obvious application of the Castle Doctrine working as it should. However, the application of the Castle Doctrine in cases involving violence among cohabitants of the home is still highly contentious both in public discourse and among legal scholars. Even though there is an increased acknowledgement of the prevalence of domestic violence in the United States, courts still disagree on whether a woman being attacked in her own home by her husband or other male cohabitant can react the same way she would if she were being attacked by an intruder. Although the state, police officers, judges, prosecutors are supposed to protect victims regardless of the place where they are victimized, the home is a highly private environment, one that keeps secrets in and intruders out. Domestic violence is often hidden masterfully well, making it very difficult for victims to disclose their plight and receive adequate justice. When domestic conflicts escalate into deadly incidents, the boundary between the private home and the public space becomes increasingly unclear. In cases where victims of domestic violence retaliate against their partners, it is often the case that the term, quote, victim is questioned because the violence has often been kept secret up to that point. The secrets of the home all of a sudden come out into the public eye, forcing the state to pry into the private environment of the home. Further, our society's increased focus on property and privacy rights proves problematic when considering the applicability of the Castle Doctrine to domestic conflicts between cohabitants when a woman is the victim. In a situation where the victim and the aggressor live under the same roof, it is difficult to find a justification for applying the every man's home is his castle, quote unquote, logic. And not just because the word man is used and not woman. After all, the ultimate question seems to be, well, whose castle is it? The victim's or the aggressor's? In my opinion, a victim of abuse should still have a castle. Applying the Castle Doctrine in a way that only allows for it to work when the intruder is a stranger is absolutely enabling violence against women, violence against children in their own homes. It is allowing abusers to get away with this shit and then also jailing women for defending themselves when it comes down to it. Women and children. As seen through statistics and studies, which I am going to break down for you. As demonstrated previously, removing the duty to retreat from situations reduces and even eliminates imminence and therefore necessity. But in situations involving cohabitants or intimate partners, the elements of imminence and necessity change, requiring an almost entirely different standard for such circumstances. When the two actors in a struggle are physically similar in size and strength, evaluating elements is simple and easy. Evaluating proportional force is easy too. But for a woman who is less likely to be the physical match of a male abuser, proportionate force becomes less clear, and imminence and necessity often must stretch to compensate for those differences. Reasonableness, too, is not looked at the same. To appease equality and attempt a fair application of the law, many judges, juries, and law enforcement at the scene completely ignore these differences to the detriment of women. I know that this includes individuals who are gender nonconforming or are in relationships that are LGBTQ+, when obviously it's not just, women and men who are physically different, right? But this is just a very specific, rampant inequality in the law that needs focus on. Women of all races are let the fuck down time and time again by the Castle Doctrine, the application of self-defense statutes, even standard ground laws. And it just further demonstrates what I already touched on in the beginning, that stand your ground and the Castle Doctrine and no retreat is a white male specific principle that they see as American, but only for Americans who are white and men, because those are the law-abiding citizens. Proponents of stand your ground laws argue that they give domestic violence victims broader protection in defending themselves by eliminating the duty to retreat, but that is just not true. The complexities of domestic violence leave out domestic violence victims in many cases. Florida's statute, for example, grants similar stand your ground protection, including the presumption, okay, we're just going to presume that you had a reasonable fear of imminent death or bodily harm to a person defending themselves against a cohabitant. While this seems to give greater protection for domestic violence victims, the presumption only applies if a protective order is in place and an imminent attack is underway. Oh yeah, how about that asterisk exception? Oh, only if a protective order is in place. Oh, so then they wouldn't even be a cohabitant in the first place. Right. I'm not even going to get into the monologue of why that is so back-ass words and why it is so prevalent for women to not obtain fucking protective orders because, they don't fucking work. And also, women in domestic violence situations who are co-fucking habitants obviously don't have a protective order against the other person because they're in that situation right now. They're in the castle, they're in the prison, they're in the dungeon. Get a fucking brain. Fuck. Practically speaking, of course, this grants no more protection than traditional self-defense statutes, which did not do much for domestic violence victims anyway, quote unquote. Donna Coker, a domestic violence law expert, stated, quote, she does not think that stand your ground benefits women facing intimate partner violence in any way that they wouldn't have had under the prior law, end quote. Simply put, stand your ground laws were not written for domestic violence victims, and specifically, they were not written for women. That reason has been backfilled to get more people on board, however, which is ridiculous. Justifications for homicides committed by women, especially in stand your ground states, is more likely to be found if the person killed was a stranger than if the person killed was an abuser. However, interpreting stand your ground laws should produce unbiased, equal results for all homicides, whether they involve a stranger or a new person. I repeat, if your stand your ground law really did what you think it fucking is doing, interpreting stand your ground laws should have produced, and should produce, but does not, Unbiased equal results for all homicides, whether they involve a stranger or a new person, because the stranger or a known person element isn't even fucking written in the law, right? Why the fuck would it matter? Oh, because you hate women. Just say that next time. Stand your ground laws as written regarding domestic violence victims, combined with the hesitancy of bitch-ass law enforcement to take reports of domestic violence seriously, result in, and also combine with victims assuming they will also not be fucking taken seriously. Duh. Believe women? No. Like that one, whatever, interview that was going around the internet, okay, the last couple weeks, where someone was going up to women on the street and asking if they would rather be trapped or lost in a forest with a bear or a man, like a strange man. And it was like overwhelming. Women were picking bear, and all these men were just chatting all this shit about whatever, all that shit. And the best comment was, well, no, obviously we would pick the bear because at least when a bear attacks us, you'd believe us. Thank you. If stand your ground laws worked for female domestic violence victims as well as they work for men, then women like Deven Gray would not face murder charges. In 2017, Alabama resident Gray shot and killed her boyfriend during a domestic dispute. Although she was bleeding from a head wound, had broken bones in her face, and had other injuries when police arrived on the scene, her stand your ground claim was denied because the judge did not believe her life had been in immediate danger. Her boyfriend had pistol whipped her and fired multiple shots in the home, but that was not enough to demonstrate an immediate threat. She went to prison. In another Alabama case, Brittany Smith was brutally raped and threatened with death and the death of her family members when a friend she let stay in her house overnight attacked her. When her attacker, Todd Smith, wanted to get cigarettes, her brother Chris drove her and Todd to a local store where Brittany was able to write down Todd's name on a piece of paper and give it to the cashier, who happened to be Todd's ex-wife and knew Brittany. When they got back to Brittany's house, she told Chris to talk to the cashier, and when he did, he returned to the house with a gun. A fight broke out, and Todd, fueled by alcohol, meth, and a few other drugs, overpowered Chris. Brittany, fearing for both of their lives, shot and killed her attacker and rapist, Todd. In October 2020, after her stand your ground claim was denied, earlier that year, Brittany pled guilty in a deal that reduced her sentence from 20 years to only 18 months. Contrast those cases with the 2019 Wyoming case of Jason John. John shot unarmed Wesley Willow Jr. a total of 9 times, including multiple rounds in his back and one in the back of his head with an AR-15 rifle. Willow came to John's home with 2 other people, and John met them on the porch holding the rifle. The details become unclear at this point, and despite missing and inconsistent facts, John won his stand your ground pretrial hearing. As this was the first case to invoke the stand your ground law in Wyoming after its passage in 2018, controversy was so heavy that the judge advised both the prosecution and the defense that whatever the outcome of her ruling, they should immediately appeal it to the state Supreme Court. She ruled that the law compelled her to presume John had a reasonable belief that deadly force was necessary and that she had to let him walk free. The Wyoming Supreme Court agreed. Domestic violence victims should also have a castle that they are allowed to defend, and they do not have a duty to retreat from. But because they are women, and because they are defending themselves against someone they know, suddenly the application of the law is different, even though those factors are never written into the law and should not be considered, in my opinion, once all the other elements are taken into account properly. The seminal case of State versus Stewart from 1988 demonstrates this. In Stewart, a Kansas jury had acquitted a woman, Peggy Stewart, who killed her abusive husband, Mike Stewart, in his sleep. The state, contending that the trial court erred in giving a self-defense instruction when there was no imminent danger, filed a reserved question to resolve whether the Kansas statute excused homicide by a battered wife with no evidence of a deadly threat or imminent danger, contemporaneous with the killing. While the Kansas Supreme Court could not reverse Peggy's acquittal, it answered definitively that the trial court erred in giving a self-defense instruction since Peggy shot her husband in his sleep and therefore was not in, quote, imminent danger. The court also noted that the trial court's instruction allowing the jury to use Peggy's subjective belief that she was in imminent danger to determine the reasonableness of her actions rather than the viewpoint of a reasonable person in her circumstances was in error. It is important to lay out a few of the facts that the Kansas Supreme Court did have in its disposal and used in its opinion and when it concluded that there was no, quote, imminent threat to Peggy. Peggy Stewart married Mike Stewart in 1974. Evidence at trial disclosed a long history of abuse by Mike against Peggy and her 2 daughters from one of her prior marriages. Laura, one of Peggy's daughters, testified that early in the marriage, Mike hit and kicked Peggy, and that after the first year of the marriage, Peggy exhibited signs of severe psychological problems. Subsequently, Peggy was hospitalized and diagnosed as having symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. She responded to treatment and was soon released. It appeared to Laura, however, that Mike was encouraging Peggy to take more than her prescribed dosage of medication. In 1977, 2 social workers informed Peggy that they had received reports that Mike was taking indecent liberties with her daughters. Because the social workers did not want Mike to be left alone with the girls, Peggy quit her job. In 1978, Mike began to taunt Peggy by stating that Carla, her 12-year-old daughter, was, quote, more of a wife to him than Peggy. Later, Carla was placed in a detention center, and Mike forbade Peggy and Laura to visit her. When Mike finally allowed Carla to return home in the middle of the summer, he forced her to sleep in an unair-conditioned room with the windows nailed shut, to wear a heavy flannel nightgown, and to cover herself with heavy blankets. Mike would then wake Carla at 5:30 a.m. and force her to do all of the housework. Peggy and Laura were not allowed to help Carla or speak to her. When Peggy confronted Mike and demanded that the situation cease, Mike responded by holding a shotgun to Peggy's head and threatening to kill her. Mike once kicked Peggy so violently in the chest and ribs that she required hospitalization. Finally, when Mike ordered Peggy to kill and bury Carla, she refused and filed for divorce. Peggy's attorney in the divorce action later testified that Peggy was afraid, terrified, for both her and her children's lives. One night, in a fit of anger, Mike threw 12-year-old Carla out of the house. Carla, who was not yet in her teens, was forced out of the home with no money, no coat, and no place to go. When the family heard that Carla was in Colorado, Mike refused to allow Peggy to contact or even talk about Carla. Mike's intimidation of Peggy continued to escalate. One morning, Laura found her mother hiding on the school bus, terrified and begging the driver to take her to a neighbor's home. That Christmas, Mike threw the turkey dinner to the floor, chased Peggy outside, grabbed her by the hair, rubbed her face in the dirt, and then kicked and beat her. After Laura moved away, Peggy's life became even more isolated. Once, when Peggy was working at a cafe, Mike came in and ran all the customers off with a gun because he wanted Peggy to go home and have sex with him right that minute. He raped her, abused both drugs and alcohol, and amused himself by terrifying Peggy, once waking her from a sound sleep by beating her with a baseball bat. He shot one of Peggy's pet cats and then held the gun against her head and threatened to pull the trigger. Peggy told friends that Mike would hold a shotgun to her head and threatened to blow it off, and indicated that one day he would probably kill her. In May 1986, Peggy left Mike and ran away to Laura's home in Oklahoma. It was the first time Peggy had left Mike without telling him. Because Peggy was suicidal, Laura had her admitted to a hospital. There, she was diagnosed as having toxic psychosis as a result of an overdose of her medication, as encouraged by Mike. On May 30th, 1986, Mike called to say he was coming to get her. Peggy agreed to return to Kansas. Peggy told her nurse she felt like she wanted to shoot her husband. At trial, she testified that she decided to return with Mike because she was not able to get the medical help she needed in Oklahoma. When Mike arrived at the hospital, he told the staff that he, quote, needed his housekeeper. The hospital released Peggy to Mike's care. He immediately drove her back to Kansas. Mike told Peggy that all of her problems were in her head, and he would be the one to tell her what was good for her and not the doctors. Peggy testified that Mike threatened to kill her if she ever ran away again. As soon as they arrived at the house, Mike forced Peggy into the house and raped her several times. The next morning, Peggy discovered a loaded .357 Magnum. She testified she was afraid of the gun. She hid the gun under the mattress of the bed in a spare room. Later that morning, as she cleaned the house, Mike kept making remarks that she should not bother because she would not be there long, or that she should not bother with her things because she could not take them with her. She testified she was afraid Mike was going to kill her. Mike's parents visited Mike and Peggy that afternoon. Mike's father testified that Peggy and Mike were affectionate with each other during the visit. Later, after Mike's parents left, Mike again raped Peggy and forced her to perform oral sex. After watching television, Mike and Peggy went to bed at 8 p.m. As Mike slept, Peggy thought about suicide and heard voices in her head repeating over and over, "Kill or be killed." At this time, there were 2 vehicles in the driveway and Peggy had access to the car keys. About 10 p.m., Peggy went to the spare bedroom and removed the gun from under the mattress, walked back to the bedroom, and killed her husband while he slept. She then ran to the home of a neighbor who called the police. The Kansas Supreme Court held that the trial court erred in giving a self-defense instruction since Peggy shot her husband in his sleep and therefore was not in quote-unquote imminent danger. The court also noted that the trial court's instruction allowing the jury to use Peggy's subjective belief that she was in imminent danger to determine the reasonableness of her actions was in error. While the Kansas Supreme Court said the issue in this case was a lack of quote-unquote imminence, it is clear from the facts that Peggy, as any reasonable person in her position would, feared that she would be killed when Mike woke up. This suggests not a lack of imminence, but rather a faulty and restrictive understanding of imminence in the context of domestic violence that was forced upon Peggy and essentially forced her to make an unfair risk calculation that, when applied to specifically women and domestic violence victims, often results in the woman going to prison for arguably justifiable self-defense. A quick glance at the facts could lead a jury to reasonably find that the circumstances surrounding the killing were sufficient to create a reasonable belief in the defendant that the use of deadly force was necessary. The jury instructions the trial used came largely from those suggested by the Kansas Supreme Court itself just 6 years earlier in State v. Simon. The Kansas Supreme Court, in its ruling, admitted that the test for self-defense, as I've restated a million fucking times across all jurisdictions, includes both a subjective and objective standard, right? Objectively reasonable person in the subjective situation that the person is in. But it somehow found that the trial court just took it too far when it used the court's own suggested language in addition to a sentence about subjective belief. Why, you may ask? Probably because the jury instructions that it pulled from, the prior Kansas Supreme Court case, dealt with a man and not a domestic violence victim woman in the home. Suddenly it's different. Suddenly it's news. Because again, I'm not just talking about, we can argue about imminence all day long. Of course we fucking can. But if you want to apply imminence in the back-asswards way that you always do for the dudes, okay? The Castle Doctrine, no duty to retreat, threaten the home. The fact that it's somehow wildly different for women when they know the person is crazy. And it's just something to think about. I know that there are a lot of different things that can go on with these cases. And of course, we shouldn't broaden imminence to be, tomorrow morning you're going to kill me, so I'll kill you now. Of course not, okay? But do you see the irony? Do you see how hypocritical this shit is? And terrifying, truly. While the Kansas Supreme Court confusingly shut down its own suggested language for reasonableness in the Peggy case and the Peggy ruling, perhaps the hesitation lay in applying a standard that was never made to fit Peggy's case, bars. The use of reasonable quote-unquote man in the Kansas Supreme Court suggested language is emblematic of a legal standard that puts women like Peggy at a disadvantage in self-defense cases. This standard will never be the right fit for women who kill their abusers because the reasonable person is, by its original definition, a man. That just gave me chills. When judges and juries apply the law, they decide which norms and actions strike the right balance between maximizing the individual or group's freedom while minimizing intrusiveness. This leads to a culture where reasonableness is by default coded as a male trait. Even the Stewart opinion is coded with language suggesting a lack of reasonableness by Peggy, a severely abused woman. As an introductory phrase to set up Peggy and Mike's marriage, the opinion reads, quote, "Following an annulment from her first husband and 2 subsequent divorces in which she was the petitioner, Peggy Stewart married Mike Stewart in 1974. The court, by doing this, immediately puts her judgment of relationships into relevance in the opinion, where it has none. If there was plausible deniability that this judgment was the reason for bringing up her previous relationships, the doubt disintegrates at in which she was the petitioner." Basically, inserting the fact that she was the one divorcing these men. Fuck you to every single justice on that Kansas Supreme Court. I know what y'all were doing. Do you see how language is important? Do you see why that's important? Do you see why from sentence number fucking 1, we knew how that opinion was going to play out? Do you see how sexism is so fucking ingrained in our legal system in ways that you can't even fathom? Same. The court reveals the predicament of reasonableness for a woman. It is unreasonable for a woman to be in multiple marriages and to instigate multiple divorces to leave her husbands, but it is also unreasonable for her to not to attempt to leave her current husband for a second time after he has threatened to kill her if she ever left again. Thank you. Love that, Kansas Supreme Court. Go fuck yourselves. The court in Stewart also focused on Peggy's physical ability to retreat from the home, despite documented failed and dangerous attempts to leave Mike prior to that night, in which he chased her and beat her and kicked her and dragged her back in by the hair. The court's retreat calculation and any self-defense law that bakes retreat into the analysis is fundamentally incompatible with the experience of domestic violence survivors. In domestic violence, quote-unquote, safe retreat is not a realistic possibility, as women know. As all women know. In fact, retreat is often extremely dangerous. Research shows that 77% of domestic violence-related homicides happen upon separation. I repeat, 77% of domestic violence-related homicides happen upon separation. By the Stewart Court's reasoning, the only reasonable domestic violence victim is the one who stays and gets killed. A California Court of Appeals court previously held that if someone kills out of self-defense against another member of the household, the presumption of reasonableness is removed. I repeat, the presumption of reasonableness is removed, at least as held in a California Court of Appeals case called Gleghorn. This means a victim would have to prove reasonableness when there is a presumption that killing a member of your household is unreasonable. For the reasons mentioned above and common sense, I point to, the cards are stacked against victims of domestic violence who are usually women in proving reasonableness. This becomes even more complicated when considering once again the incompatibility of traditional Castle Doctrine and self-defense principles and the reality of gender violence. This defense was designed for male-on-male violence. I repeat, this defense was designed for male-on-male violence, such as single incident aggression in the bar or on a street or in your home. In contrast, in situations in which women find themselves in need of defending themselves are likely to show up in the home. More than half of all female homicide victims were killed in relation to intimate partner violence, with more than 98% of perpetrators being men. On the other hand, about 4.9% of male murder victims are killed by an intimate partner. It is unclear what proportion of that 4.9% percentage were killed by women acting in self-defense, but there is reason to believe that this number, in part, reflects this phenomenon. For victims of domestic abuse in their own home, in their castle, that turns into a dungeon. The loss of control and threat of violence is constant. Indeed, statistically, research has shown that the threat of violence will nearly always result in enacted violence at some point in the relationship. The periods of calm are not a lack of abuse, but rather are periods of control made evident by the victim staying with her abuser and being made compliant. The abuser will use what's called sentinel events, quote unquote, as enforcement to regain control if they feel like the victim is gaining autonomy. A sentinel event is defined as, quote, an unexpected occurrence involving death or serious physical or psychological injury or the risk thereof. Rather than a cycle of escalation that reverts back to a honeymoon phase, this theory posits that the relationship fluctuates between violence and the threat of violence. There is no honeymoon phase. It's either violence or the threat, whether it be implicit, underlying, or expressed. Thus, for a victim, there is always, I repeat, always an imminent fear of violence, always imminent. It's always imminent. This modern and inclusive understanding of domestic violence is necessary in order to avoid punishing victims for not being the right type of victim or the right defender of the castle. Yet, even knowing what we know about the reality of women abused, elements of a traditional self-defense claim and a claim regarding the Castle Doctrine cannot and do not account for these realities. Requiring the imminent danger to be contemporaneous with the killing, like the Kansas Supreme Court required in Stewart, ignores the fact that in an abusive relationship there is constant imminent danger, even on the best day, as the cycle of violence escalates. And Peggy's case, oh, you think Peggy's case is like the only one that, no. This repeated punishment. We repeatedly punish women who are victims of domestic violence for defending themselves against their abusers. We repeatedly do. Not to make you super jazzed or anything, but yeah, I could go on and on and on, but here's just a few more. Despite often overwhelming evidence, it remains difficult for survivors to prove their fear of violence was, quote, reasonable in self-defense situations. In 2014, Laya Baru was convicted of felony assault for shooting her husband. Baru asserts her husband slammed her into a wall, pulled her hair, and struck her in the ribs. In fear, she grabbed his gun and shot, thinking it was empty. Baru was being physically abused in her own home by a violent man in possession of a handgun. Yet she was still convicted of felony assault after she grabbed his gun in fear to protect herself. This was not the first time he had physically abused her. Baru met her husband while he was working at the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia. He became violent after they moved to America, and she was in constant fear for her life. After serving her felony assault prison term, she was picked up by Immigration and Customs Enforcement and detained there despite being a permanent resident. An assistant district attorney stated of her prosecution that, quote, the only evidence, oh, this is going to piss me off. The only evidence that the defendant was a victim of domestic violence was provided by the defendant. The evidence clearly showed that she shot the victim in the back while he was fleeing from the home and that he posed no immediate threat to the defendant. Baru was convicted in California, which uses the Castle Doctrine. So Baru was in her home. Weird. Ugh, piss me off. Don't piss me off. What's more, California's criminal jury instructions read, quote, a defendant is not required to retreat. He or she is entitled to stand his or her ground and defend himself or herself, and, if reasonably necessary, to pursue an assailant until the danger has passed. This is so even if safety could have been achieved by retreating. That is the Castle Doctrine in California, and she was still convicted. Perfect. Even in a state with expansive self-defense laws, courts often insist on applying standards differently to women, notably women of color. In 2010, Marissa Alexander was charged with aggravated assault in Florida, the state that put stand your ground laws on the map, for firing a warning shot to scare off her abusive, estranged husband. Alexander went to the home she used to share with her estranged husband to grab some of her things when he showed up unexpectedly and eventually threatened to kill her. Alexander ran to her car to leave, but could not because the garage door was broken. So she retrieved her gun and fired a warning shot at a wall, for which she received a 20-year sentence. Oh, don't piss me off. Oh, don't piss me the fuck off. That was in 2010. Stand your ground, huh? Castle Doctrine, huh? Weird how it only applies to men. Florida Congresswoman Corinne Brown pointed out the contradiction. Quote, the Florida criminal justice system has sent two clear messages today. One is that if women who are victims of domestic violence try to protect themselves, the stand your ground law will not apply to them. The second is that if you are Black, the system will treat you differently. I mean, those messages were clear. clear cut. I guess some people learn things late. Just undercuts the fact that stand your ground laws do not supply the clear cut self-defense regime it apparently envisioned. The erratic application of stand your ground and Castle Doctrine laws increases the risk people take in using force to fend off an aggressor, leading to wildly different determinations of what actions qualify for stand your ground immunity and who gets to enjoy the benefits of that immunity. For example, in Florida, inconsistencies do not just occur in different parts of the state, but also within the same fucking city. In one case, Damaro Battle shot Omar Bonilla after the two men argued, and Bonilla fired a shot into the ground. Bonilla went inside the house where the two men were at a party. Battle, however, walked to his car to retrieve a gun and returned, shooting Bonilla 3 times. Battle claimed stand your ground immunity and was never charged. In the same city, Reginald Etienne was sentenced to life in prison when he stabbed and killed Joshua Sands after leaving the scene to retrieve a knife. Inconsistently applying the law furthers its inefficacy. No shit. If stand your ground really protects would-be victims from threats of attack, then it should be, in theory, applied consistently to embolden people to use it for such self-defense purposes. After all, Florida State House Representative Dennis K. Baxley, a sponsor of the stand your ground law, stated that the point of the law is to assure citizens that, quote, when attacked, the presumption will be with them. However, the law was never against citizens protecting themselves. Self-defense laws, including the self-defense law in Florida before stand your ground, were literally never against, the presumption was never against fucking victims, ever. Oh, but stand your ground laws being put in place make them safer. That's funny. States with stand your ground laws have demonstrated increased homicide rates, period. Even when homicide rates in the United States have been declining for more than a decade prior to Florida's law in 2005. On the extreme end, Florida's monthly homicide rate increased 24.4% from 2005 when the state enacted the State Your Ground law through 2014. That's wild. Firearm-related homicide increased 31.6% in the same period. In general, states with stand your ground laws noted an 8% increase in overall homicides, while states without stand your ground laws saw little or no increase in rates of homicide or firearm-related homicide in the same time periods. The increase in rates can also partly be because stand your ground laws lower the expected legal costs associated with self-defense. If no one has to calculate retreat and risk miscalculating it, returning force no longer poses as much of a risk to the victim defending themselves. Legal consequences no longer outweigh prioritizing the life of the person being attacked over the aggressor. But if this is so, the crime challenged by those standing their ground would decrease, as the expected costs of committing a crime that is likely to provoke defensive behavior increases due to the increased risk of force, justifiable, of course, that may be used to stop such a crime. Ultimately, as statistic numbers, raw data shows, stand your ground laws increase homicide while never decreasing those crimes that the law would likely try to deter, namely burglary, robbery, and aggravated assault. So it's doing nothing, literally at all. I love living in the purge. How's Florida? Amazing. Even before stand your ground laws were in effect, okay, there has been a clash between the Castle Doctrine and police, law enforcement. Why, you may ask? Because of this whole idea of knock and announce warrants. And when the police decide to do a no-knock warrant, and then the people inside Castle Doctrine defend their home because they don't know what the fuck's going on, but ultimately that results in people dying. What happens when these doctrines clash? Okay, who wins? Who wins when technically the law absolutely justified that person in pulling the trigger? Well, you can fucking guess. The knock and announce rule is a constitutional requirement for a reasonable search or seizure that generally requires police officers to announce their presence before serving a warrant. However, in Hudson versus Michigan, the Supreme Court of the United States concluded that the Constitution does not require the exclusion of evidence to remedy knock and announce violations, meaning there is no legal consequence to police not knocking. So there's no deterrent. The Castle Doctrine, a product of English common law, was an absolute defense from all criminal and civil liability when a homeowner reasonably defended his or her home. Realized now in state statutes, the Castle Doctrine generally creates a presumption of reasonableness when defending the home. The policies driving these two doctrines are, however, inconsistent after Hudson. One allows for homeowners to defend their castle using deadly force, but the erosion of the other has destroyed any compelling reason for police to respect that castle. And this cannot be demonstrated any more than in the case of Breonna Taylor. The windows shook and the walls rattled when Louisville police officers used a battering ram to forcibly enter the home of Breonna Taylor in the midnight hour of March 13th, 2020. Afraid for their lives and unsure of the identity of the people aggressively knocking their way inside, Taylor's boyfriend Kenneth Walker opened fire. The police officers involved that night have repeatedly asserted they knocked loudly for 90 seconds, eventually giving notice of their identity, police, and purpose, warrant, before returning fire, killing Breonna Taylor. However, the 911 call Walker made that night suggests at a minimum he and Taylor had no idea who had barged in with guns blazing. And as you know from my prior episode called The Dirty Liars, police lie all the time and get away with it all the time. So this is not surprising. Conflicting accounts remained unresolved as to whether the officers truly announced their presence and purpose or not. A state grand jury ultimately returned an indictment against only one of the responding officers for wanton endangerment, though a jury ultimately acquitted that officer. As the knock and announce rule has become more vulnerable, the existence of no-knock warrants further exploits its vulnerability. In the case of Wilson, the Supreme Court of the United States recognized that the knock and announce rule is not an inflexible standard. No-knock warrants reflect this adaptability and the reality that some circumstances may require special exceptions. But the existence of no-knock warrants contributes to the conflicting messages sent by policymakers pertaining to the rights protected by the knock and announce rule in and of itself. Also contributing to the erosion of the knock and announce rule is police militarization, the recent trend of local law enforcement agencies using military-grade equipment and tactics. Many no-knock warrants have been linked with aggressive raids associated with police militarization. Examples include the use of armored personnel carriers, assault rifles, submachine guns, flashbang grenades, grenade launches, sniper rifles, and SWAT teams. As these trends continue, the context in which the Hudson case was originally decided has fundamentally changed. Yet, the Castle Doctrine remains in place. How do we rationalize those two existing, the no-knock warrant and the Castle Doctrine? Well, we rationalize it with casualties. And this isn't the first time and won't be the last. The only way to ensure police compliance with the knock and announce rule, to properly knock and announce the way they did not in the Breonna Taylor case, is to apply the exclusionary rule for knock and announce violations. The knock and announce rule can only be strengthened by, quote, removing the incentive to disregard it. Without this strengthening, the knock and announce rule will remain a withered branch upon the American legal tree. My rebuttal for today's episode is this. Stand your ground laws promised to lower crime rates, increase neighborhood safety, and allow domestic violence victims terrorized by abuse to defend themselves. Instead, they have allowed racism to infect people's actions in new and entirely legal ways, increased homicide, decreased safety, failed domestic violence victims by creating more barriers to safety, and also completely ignored the reality of law enforcement, no-knock warrants, and the conflicting Castle Doctrine. The hastily prepared legislation was pushed through without any real determinations on how it would be interpreted, applied to real circumstances, or abused. Ultimately, the secondary effects that create ripples through people's lives and their communities went unconsidered in hopes of a fast, easy solution to problems that either did not exist or would not even be fixed by these laws. Self-defense remained and still remains a justification defense, not to make lives more difficult for those who needed it, but to make sure it was needed when used. Stand Your Ground removes that legal stigma and with it the restraint that limited it to only those unusual circumstances where other means could not reach, while failing to solve any problems it had so raucously promised to fix. The issues stemming from the natural human impulse of self-preservation, self-defense, that innate biological response, have existed from humanity's inception, as I stated, from biblical fucking times. No gun lobby, more focused on protecting the gun than the person, could have possibly crafted the nuanced legislation required to allow the angels of our better nature to overcome our deeply rooted biases and misinterpretations that occur under deadly stress. Repealing these laws and replacing them with studied, carefully thought out laws that protect domestic violence victims and ensure people use deadly force when truly necessary will restore the safety and security Stand Your Ground laws promised but could not possibly deliver. This has been another episode of the Rebuttal Podcast. Thank you for joining me today again for a heavy episode, but a necessary one. I love you guys. I appreciate you. Follow, like, subscribe, comment. I love hearing your thoughts. You're all brilliant and lovely, and I'm so honored that you are on the other side of my screen, on the other side of my mic. Thank you for being here. See you next time.